Okay, welcome back to the Xanadu Review. My name is Prester John, but you can call me PJ. Today on the pod, I have Casey Shea Gallagher, who writes the Secondary Contradictions blog. Casey, do you want to tell the audience a little about yourself, the kind of writing you do?
Hey everyone. So as PJ said, I'm Casey Shea Gallagher. It's actually pretty important that you say Shea there because Casey Gallagher is a professional darts player in the women's league in the UK, and I don't want us mixed up. She probably has a little bit larger audience than me. I started Secondary Contradictions a while back with the intention of writing on like culture war or social issues from a class first sort of perspective, rather kind of classical Marxist kind of perspective, which I did a little bit of, and I continue to do a little bit of, but it's actually gotten far more expansive than that since I started writing more personal things to try to keep up a writing habit. And those have actually been some of the more successful pieces that people have engaged with the most. So I have no intention to stick too strictly to my original plan for the publication moving forward, but I do have plans to get back to those topics here and there.
Very cool. Yeah, as of today, you just recently published one on cats and dogs, which cats and dog people, which I thought was pretty good.
Yeah, and of course, that's a classic debate in the socialist world is which is better, cats or dogs.
Yeah, I think Marx and Engels had a dialogue on that a while back. If I remember reading their letters, Marx was a cat person, unsurprisingly.
It makes sense.
Yeah, so I know we've talked a little bit in the DMs over the last year and kind of become friends. And one of the things we've bonded over is both being, I don't know, I guess you could say, kind of redneck, white trash, what do you want to call it, who made good and went into the tech world and kind of ended up living, in my case, a very blue state. In your case, you're in Europe. So what's that been like for you, that transition, especially like seeing the culture shift over the years? Because I know like the whole like H-1B debate is really big right now in the tech world, and it feels like there's a kind of a vibe shift in the culture of the tech world in the last couple of years.
Well, I think the main thing to be said is that everyone should learn to code. It's the only job that's real, and it's definitely going to be around forever. So that's certainly good advice, is to learn to code in 2024 and to get into this industry because there's so many jobs. But the jokes aside, the shifts in there have been pretty massive culturally. And I think that in Europe, we had maybe a sort of preview of the pushback on H-1B that came in the form of what's called the European Blue Card, which is very uncreatively named because it's kind of like a green card for the European Union, where highly skilled immigrants, which basically meant software developers and other kinds of engineers, could get this sort of sponsorship from one country that would then allow them to move to almost anywhere in the EU. And of course, H-1B is a very different scheme from that because you're far less tied to your employer in this blue card scheme. But it does have the same kind of implications in terms of people hiring from abroad when there was plenty of talent, locally that was perhaps a little bit more expensive than they wanted to go for. But in addition to that, I think I've seen, now I don't know about you, but I've always worked in rather large companies in tech, and I've seen the increasing isolation of the DEI people into their little corner where you hear from them all the time, but they're just over in their corner. How about you? Have you seen?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to say. I think I worked in like kind of a couple different size companies right now. Right now, I'm at a pretty large company. And I know you're a software engineer that's your full thing, right? Or
yeah, that's the primary thing that I've done.
Primary, yeah. So right now, I've kind of gone all over the place a little bit. Some end user facing stuff, but now I mostly do infrastructure. So part of me does wonder if the infrastructure side, because it's maybe a little less sexy, it's a little bit more immune to like the DEI, whatever you want to call it, that certain culture that definitely felt like I had a foothold for a while. Because before that, I was at a startup, and they went full into DEI, the pronouns and bio, all that. Um, but it seems like a lot of that's being walked back because where I am right now, we had a manager who was um, really into that. And funny enough, like all the women who worked with her hated her, and there was, she
Hmm.
got fired because she had so many HR complaints against her. Which, funny enough, the
Now
more you
that's
try
classic.
to not, yeah, many such cases, right? But it does feel like that's losing purchase. It's because at least I think but for the audience, like Malcolm Q&A or Q&A or however it's
Yeah, yeah,
pronounced. So he's the Swedish writer who talks about the concept of wokeness as make work, basically, for
mm,
a lot of these people who get these kind of extraneous degrees who really, maybe don't necessarily belong in the tech world just based on skills, but they see that's where the money is, that's where the prestige
yeah,
is. And what's his name? Peter Turchin has also talked about
yeah,
the concept of once again understanding wokeness as like a phenomenon of elite overproduction. So you're seeing the same
yeah,
thing where there's so many positions. There's only so many positions, right? Kind of like you said, obviously being sarcastic, like, it's a very crowded marketplace. And if you want to be just a software engineer, just a coder, you were shit out of luck even before Chat GPT came out, in my
yeah,
opinion. So the
yeah.
H1B thing, it's almost superfluous, really.
You really
So
have to
that
be a wonderkind now. Like you have to be the most autistically genius guy in the world,
mhm.
um,
And
or you're
which is
just
to say,
struggling.
don't have boundaries and have a lot of different skills.
So
Which
if we can maybe mention this aspect of the H-1B thing, I don't think that there's any way to avoid the aspect that a lot of times when you work with an office of people who are primarily like H-1B um, employees, there's a lot of nepotism that means that the quality goes out the window. Like you'd have to work 3 times as hard as somebody who doesn't have the connection from what is basically like an ethnic mafia in some of these offices. And I
yeah,
think that's one of the reasons a lot of people are really objecting to this sort of free trade brain mentality that Elon and Ramaswamy are apparently pushing.
yeah. I mean, we'll see how much actual, like, what kind of legs really get under that. But kind of to speak to your point too, it's funny how, like, once again, be it my super woke supervisor who ended up getting fired for trying to be like basically way too conscious of race and gender and stuff, that she might as well have been screaming racial slurs at a certain point, to the point like you can tell how much it's on her mind. um uh, you're kind of like recreating these, open, like, ethnic good old boy networks. And here's the thing, like, I do see, like, there's a lot of, like, racism against Indian people that really, they're, you can say what you will about, ethnic mafias, and, maybe ethnic mafia is not the right term, but these networks of people that you're seeing, be it Indian, what have
Mhm.
you. um I kind of lost my train of thought. So, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, I think the main thing to be said about that is that there is clear historical precedent for the same thing happening anywhere you have a sort of cartel of um, people who are hiring. So, like the classic example would be it's there were times when it's almost in places where it's almost impossible to get a job in a certain industry if you're not Italian or if you're not Irish. Like for famously, the police in many cities in New England were basically an Irish gang at parts of the turn of the century and things like this. So I think it would be a big mistake to uh, understand it as something that is like a uniquely Indian phenomenon, or even as I'll go on about, like, I don't like the fact that they're always upper caste and they're often discriminating against lower caste Indians, but it's not even unique to that. It's something that is played out throughout American history whenever the opportunity was present.
Yeah, absolutely. And it kind of the one of the main criticisms I have of it going into that too is, even if you're looking at from a labor point of view, I think you touched on a lot of the times they don't do good work, and it's not just, I think a lot of people, oh, making comments on Indians as a nationality, but kind of like you said, you're going to see this over and over again. Because right now, I support, and so I do like infrastructure automation stuff, and we support an offshore team, and it's probably about, I don't know, a third of the people that I support, but it's like 70% of my work, just because
Mhm.
they are paid by the test, not by test results. So they're incentivized to just put in a bunch of shitty code, a bunch of
Mhm.
shitty tests, and you're not getting results. But have you looked into? We don't necessarily have to do a super deep dive on this, but kind of how, at least in like the U.S. system, how an H-1B works, and it's almost like indentured servitude in a lot of cases. They'll
Yeah.
get people who their one qualification is they speak English, and then you once you get them over here, like they can't. They're married to that employer, so they're
Mhm.
being their labor is being exploited. It's basically like a brain drain of India. Or my wife works in like the HR world, and she said India is more or less on the way out. Like the Philippines or parts of Africa
Mhm.
are because even India is becoming too expensive. So you're just seeing this pattern repeat over and over again.
Mhm.
And in the U.S. or it sounds like Europe to a certain degree, there's just been not enough new organic talent that's being trained. So it's
Yeah.
I mean, imagine that billionaires who their whole thing is maximizing profits are doing what billionaires who try to maximize profits do, and are almost immediately betraying the MAGA base.
Mhm. No, I mean, you hit it right on the head with the fact that it's basically indentured servitude, and that's what makes it so different from what we have in Europe, where there's a lot more mobility. And when I'm saying Europe generically, because I don't yet talk about which specific country I live in, but it's a major EU country, and we have similarities in this regard to all of them. But you're much freer in your ability to move around between jobs once you have an employer-sponsored visa in most of these countries compared to if you have an H-1B visa in the US. And obviously, that's why somebody like Ramaswamy or Musk, to keep using these guys as examples, wants the H-1B system. They don't want a freer system for highly skilled immigrants at all. They don't want to compromise where you can come in as a highly skilled immigrant with a points-based system, sort of like Canada has. Not that Canada is doing great with this stuff, but and then you can compete with people in the local market. They want to be able to own these really smart guys that they're importing.
Own is definitely the right word for that.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, it really is. When you live in a place like Mountain View, California, and you work at a place like Facebook or something, Meta now, whatever they're calling it, and your rent is $3,500 a month for a closet, and uh, you can't change employers. You do what they tell you.
Pretty
They have your
much.
ass.
Have you followed? This is unverified, so if it's posted and I'm completely wrong about this, my bad. But you get the idea. You're seeing more of like a return to like almost mini company towns where like you can have like a chunk of your pay go to your rent, which would be a little bit smaller, and you're living in the pod at Amazon, Google, what have you.
I haven't heard about this actually. It sounds like the plot of Sorry to Bother You. Uh, it's a movie that
Yeah.
Boots Riley made.
I've heard good things about that. It was there was a lot of buzz around it at the time, but I
Mhm.
usually only see a movie like at least 4 years after the
Mhm.
cultural conversation around it has happened. So maybe now's the time to see that. Sorry to
There's
bother you, sir.
I went and watched it when it was in theaters with my dad, and it was a very funny experience because he's just quite a button button down old guy. And there's a big twist in the movie where it starts becoming more of a sci-fi thing than a cultural commentary movie. And he walked out and he was like, "What the hell did we just watch?" So I highly recommend it. It's quite
Yeah.
amusing.
Well, that's a glowing review from your dad, because at the time it was one of those movies I kind of didn't want to see it because my only interaction with it was like super lib white people patting themselves on the back for like understanding what code switching was now.
That's true. I think that Boots Riley would probably find that perception hilarious.
Yeah. Well, again, to kind of because I know he's more of an open socialist type guy, so I think that kind of
Mhm.
loops in again really well to either the H-1B thing or the other debate being, the mass immigration that we're seeing of unskilled labor, and at least in the U.S., I'm not quite sure what the European situation is. It seems very similar though, or all across the world, what I'm seeing, China taking advantage of
Mhm.
migration. They do it a little bit different, but again, it's more or less legalized slavery in a lot of
Yeah.
cases. Because I mean, I've always said that the United States, and now kind of subsequently the world economy has never really worked without slave
Mhm.
labor, and just because that's I was having a conversation with a friend about the immigration debate, how the Democrats dealt with it versus Trump. The point I made is the Democrats didn't make significant efforts to like change your immigration laws. They just stopped enforcing the border, which is like a qualitatively different thing. If you wanted to increase the franchise and
Mhm.
make it easier for people to immigrate, that would be one thing. But you're just letting a whole bunch of people come over,
Mhm.
and they're going to be exploited.
Yeah.
Um, it undercuts native labor. They're just going to be exploited. You've created a generation of people who are just going to be completely dependent on the federal government. And once again, like it makes it so difficult to have these conversations now. That's something we've talked about too, like left and right. At least in my opinion, I want to know because we've talked about this a little bit. At least to me, like traditional left and right, as we know them, are kind of um, based on the material conditions of like the 19th and 20th century. And I don't really think a lot of what left and right traditionally has meant, or even like, Marxism, it doesn't really apply that much to the 21st century, at least in the
Mhm.
same way. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that you're kind of pointing at something that we've both been talking to each other about, and in general about for a long time. It's kind of what led me to stop considering myself a Marxist in a political sense. It's still sort of an analytical tool that I find very powerful. But I consider myself more of like a labor nationalist or a Republican socialist now. And the reason for this is I've observed so many problems that come from the non-integration, especially of unskilled labor people who come into a country. And there's kind of two paths that I've observed in Europe. One of them is, of course, we expand the EU and then we get a brain drain and a worker drain from the East, which is absolutely going to happen the second Ukraine gets admitted. It's going to be really ugly for Ukraine.
Mhm.
And the other thing that happens is each country has its usually some kind of colonial history, um, where there's a connection with an ethnic minority who end up, several ethnic minorities who end up exploiting their fellow countrymen by sponsoring them to come over and then not giving them any real opportunity to integrate. They work in industries like cleaning or laundry or things like this, and it's like the same thing that happens with Chinese restaurants in the United States, though perhaps a little more legal than that situation. But the people who work there, a lot of the times they don't really have the opportunity to learn English, to make social connections, and to integrate into the new society that they live in. They're very much under the thumb of whoever sponsored them, even though it's not the H-1B problem where they're legally attached to them.
Yeah. Well, it kind of once again to talk about like the changing socioeconomic conditions. It Have you read or heard of like the works of I always have trouble pronouncing this guy's name. It's like Yanis Varoufakis. He's a Greek economist.
Yeah, I'm actually reading his book now on
Techno feudalism.
no, I'm reading his book called The Adults in the Room, which is about his experience negotiating the Greek debt um,
Ooh, I'll have to
when
read that one next
Syriza
because
was newly elected.
I'm in the process of reading Techno Feudalism, and
Mhm.
he and another writer because he's a Marxist, and I've also read a book by a guy called Joel Kotkin who wrote about neo feudalism, and
Mhm.
it's kind of like it's a big bummer if you're looking at it from the Marxist standpoint point of view. The working class, we took an L on this one. We missed the opportunity to seize the means of production, and now capital has accumulated to the point where it seems like we're kind of reverting to feudalism. Very embarrassing, and
Mhm.
we're just going to be serfs again.
Yeah, and I think that to bring back up, you mentioned Peter Turchin and you mentioned Malcolm K. I think that the relevance of elite theory to the concept of neo-feudalism is hard to overstate. It's important, I think, to understand where we're going, because if you have a really strictly like stagist sort of understanding of Marxism, where you think that there's no way to go back in any way, or there's no way for capitalism to adapt beyond what we call, famously late capitalism, which is a meme in itself now to call it late capitalism. It's just advanced capitalism, but it's late only in the sense that there's not much worse it can become, but it's still pretty bad, and it's this is what it looks like. It's neo-feudalism. But
Yeah.
I think that part of the most valuable work I've done politically in terms of informing myself has been expanding my sources out in that direction, which is why I read a lot of like dissident right people now.
Yeah, I think that kind of loops into one of the other things I want to talk about, because I feel like the connection here is when we talk about elite theory and some of these dissident right people. One of the name, and even like the H-1B question, one of the names that's coming up is J.D. Vance, because whether or not the degree to which you believe his origin story about being a poor white trash hillbilly who pulled himself up by the bootstraps and became a senator. And I guess, sequentially it was, he got into the venture capital, like tech world, then senator, now vice president. He is an acolyte and one of his mentors was Peter Thiel, who was
Mm-hmm.
one of these kind of, I don't know if you've read about or heard of, the PayPal mafia.
Mm-hmm.
But the idea being that we have, you're starting to see a counter elite form. And if you talk about elite theory of some of these dissident right guys, Nick Land, Curtis Yarvin, etc., for the audience at home who hasn't heard of them, the long and short of it is, at least like very broadly speaking, you're starting to see a counter elite form who the traditional power structure from the post World War II era was more internationally based, more about the United States securing strategic alliances and free trade, being the backer of the global currency, the world reserve currency. But the theory is you're starting to see that collapse because it's just no longer economically or politically viable. So you're starting to see people like, say, Elon Musk, Vivek Ramaswamy, Peter Thiel, pick your shadowy billionaire, and they're starting to try to directly influence policy to have the America first, because they think that America is still like the greatest economic engine, and we need to make sure that like we're being more like local power, more regional power. But as we're seeing, like that doesn't mean as has been made evident with the whole H-1B thing, with Elon Musk saying he just wants to import H-1B labor. It doesn't mean like the American people. It means like
Mm-hmm.
America as a economic entity.
Yeah, and I actually think that JD Vance is among that group the least neoliberal in terms of free trade. Um, and so I can never read that guy. I can never tell what I think he's serious about. But I do think that if anyone in that kind of clique is thinking, maybe I don't like that, it would be somebody like him.
Yeah, I guess
I
that
think
remains to
I
be
was in
seen.
Ohio earlier this year actually, and he was clearly a very popular, person. Like they like him there. And I wasn't in any of the like cities where universities are. I was out in the middle of nowhere, but the everywhere you go, there's just Trump Vance, um, and lots of enthusiasm for the fact that Vance is there. I think.
Yeah, I mean, and I've called him. I mean, I'm not even the first one to call him. He's the conservative Obama, basically, or at least that seems to be what they're trying. He's a well-spoken guy. He's charismatic. He's very good at what he does, but he feels a little bit kind of untrustworthy inherently to me, just because he's been such a chameleon. Um,
He
I don't
makes me
know.
want to believe in him. You know, like he's
He
he's
does,
the
and I
same
hate him for
quality
it.
as Obama in that regard. He makes you want to believe in him.
Hmm. Well, I think that's why, they tried so hard with like, oh, the JD Vance is weird thing because it they tried to get that ahead of him, but like once you heard from him, he's clearly like a very smart guy, very well spoken. And I don't know, because I guess that's another one of the things I wanted to talk to you about. Um, and at least for me, like I spent the most of my political life, the activism to the extent that I did it, much more on the lefty side. But um, I flirted with some Marxism stuff, read some Marxism, socialism, but at the end of the day, like my family is like Blue Dog, Union Democrats, Midwest on my mom's side, the South on Southern on my dad's side, and I was all about like American labor and making sure that we're not going to endless wars, um, free speech stuff like that. And there's been a significant vibe shift where it feels like some of these things have become, if not right coded, the at least in the United States, and it seems to in Europe to a certain degree, the the neoliberal shift that happened, in the 80s and 90s, and at least really kind of solidified to me with the Obama administration
Mhm.
that the establishment has become the Democrats.
Mhm.
So if you, myself, and a lot of other people find ourselves in a weird place. So I'm wondering, what was that journey like for you? Because it sounds like, because I did like DSA and shit like
Mhm.
that. I like volunteered for Bernie Sanders. But now I'm seeing, this is, we're recording on December 29th, 2024. So Donald Trump has not yet taken office, but they were campaigning on things that, traditionally I would have, associated with, Democrats. Cause, as, we've talked about, like being a like labor protectionist policies used to be a left position. Even like,
Mhm.
Bernie Sanders was saying as early as like 2008, I think, that, open borders and free trade are a Koch brothers plot. So what was your journey been like? Because it sounds like you're a little bit more open to the dissident right stuff, but also kind of came up in the more lefty Marxist tradition like me.
Yeah, I'm actually, so before I get to sort of my background, I think what you're hitting on is something that's really important about elite theory and about the work of Malcolm Kieyane we were talking about. He kind of introduced me to this idea of the institutional left in the West having become the party rather than a pandering sort of populist like formation that is based on working class voters. They become a party of the professional managerial class as theorized by people like Adolf Reed. Um, and they're now advancing their own class interests, which are, of course, like that leaves the working class up for grabs for anyone else who wants to pander to them. And I've always taken a really strong stance for like a dual power sort of strategy, where it's like you should consciously use these allies that you can develop in the ruling classes. But in order to do that, you have to have an organized group of people from the working class that are not these PMC people, which if you were involved in DSA, you see exactly how they ruin everything. They come
Mm-hmm.
in and they've read too much Foucault and not enough, and they haven't worked enough shifts at a freaking store or something.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so actually, yeah, I was also in DSA. I was in a Marxist-Leninist organization in the U.S. as well. Uh, the and before and leading up to that, I had gone through like just intellectual, uh, just very abstract politics where I was like into anarchism, and I was like, well, this was a great idea, but then I was just realized I was just a teenager, um,
Mm-hmm.
and I've become more and more open to electoral politics over and the possibilities of electoral politics throughout my life. But I think that it's always something where uh, you have to apply the historical materialist sort of perspective to understand that parties do not stay stable in who they represent, which is why, for example, we see an emerging populist movement of both the right and the left in Europe. That's kind of people recognizing that these institutional uh, parties of the right and of the left are both alienating their traditional bases. But yeah, my journey has been in that direction, but I would still say that I say the main thing that has shifted is I'm no longer feel any allegiance to the left, but I do feel that I'm still kind of on it. I think you could describe me as a left winger, but I'm not afraid of. I'm not going to use other left wingers as a barometer for what I'm supposed to think.
Yeah, I mean, I think you hit the nail on the head because to me, there's a very uh, marked difference between the economic left and the cultural left to the degree which the economic left still exists, because again, I worked before I went into tech, I worked in like factories and stuff like that, did retail, and it was always very interesting to either like in modern days or even at the beginning of some of these movements. I was reading a book called The People's Tragedy by, I can't think of the guy's name, but he was talking about the history of the Russian Revolution and the years leading up to it. And it was really funny to me because there was, he's talking about how these, not again, very similar to what we see today, like these second or third sons of Russian nobility, like, petite bourgeoisie types who would like, we have to get the peasants to rise up. So they went out to the countryside and tried to teach the peasants Marx, but they couldn't read. So they taught the peasants to read, and they didn't fucking care about reading Marx. They wanted to read books about farming, like a way to improve their material conditions, or like adventure books and entertainment. And it kind of makes me think about how, for example, in the 2020 elections, the year leading up to it, when Bernie Sanders went on the Joe Rogan Experience, there was just that seems like one of the biggest missed opportunities the Democrats had to me. You had, because Joe Rogan is supposed to like, this far right influencer guy. But in 2020, he was endorsing Bernie Sanders, and people like AOC were getting mad at him because Joe Rogan talked to people who were pick your ism, pick your ist. But you have legitimate because to me Joe Rogan and people and his fan base are not right wing. They're like the embodiment of a swing voter or maybe the average American voter who doesn't have super strong convictions other than maybe some lightly held cultural beliefs and just like kind of general economic populism. And there's just even more and more you're seeing this bifurcation. And when I was in the DSA, it was like like you said, how many people have like worked a double shift at Walmart, and how many of them are like the downwardly mobile PMC type professional managerial class, not unlike those second or third sons of Russian nobles in 1913 or 1908, I guess.
Yeah, I think you're kind of getting to a point that I have argued just specifically with a lot of other left-wing people, which is the average person will never need to understand the things that the professional revolutionaries or the people who want to do the politics need to understand in order to represent them properly. The bus driver doesn't need to have a detailed understanding of Hegelian philosophy in order to get benefits from changes in social policy and labor policy. And I felt that within any sort of institutional left-wing organization like the DSA, everybody was just like, we got to educate everybody. It's as though people don't know that their material conditions suck.
If only they knew. If somebody with a degree
somebody tell them they're
explained
poor
to them that they're being exploited.
And there was the Joe Rogan point is a great point because I've watched an embarrassing quantity of Joe Rogan, and he's just a fun dude to watch. He's a really enthusiastic interviewer, and my criticisms insofar as it matters is that he's not a journalist, right? He's not there to challenge the people. He's there to let them talk for 3 hours, and you can listen to them while you're working your double shift at Walmart. And so
that's when I listened to the most Joe Rogan in my life, when I was working in a warehouse and I just needed, I need somebody, it's free. He'll talk for 4 hours. You can just put it on in the background.
Yeah. And I mean, that's a whole, podcasting as a medium is largely biased towards this. This is why I don't understand the actual numerical popularity of some of those highly produced garbage podcasts that are from iHeartRadio network and stuff like this. Because it feels like podcasting as a medium is best designed for a friend simulator, dirtbag left, like guys sitting around and saying, "Hey, isn't it retarded that we don't have healthcare?" Like,
That is really gay that we don't have healthcare.
yeah, for real. Um, like my close personal friend Nick Mullen always says.
No. I guess you hit on another thing that I find interesting about, people, Joe Rogan or, even I think somebody, maybe one of the few people who carry a similar amount of cultural cachet, like Jon Stewart, that, they always have, I'm not a journalist, but I think again that speaks to um, the institutional failure that we're seeing. Because what is a journalist really like? There was a time where, and there's this is a part of a larger conversation about elite overproduction and like that post-war moment where all these baby boomers started going to college. And traditionally, like university was only something like that a very small percentage of the people in a population would go to, and if you could afford it, you probably were already going to be okay to begin with. And you're seeing, university degrees and credentials have become, increasingly devalued, to the point where, like, when we millennials enter the workforce, they're basically useless. If not useless, they're not the, oh, hey, puppy. Um,
For
Casey's
those
puppy
listening,
just showed up.
my dog just came into the camera
She's
screen.
very cute. But anyway, all that to say, like, these credentials don't have the value that they used to, especially in journalism. Because, like, at its base, what is journalism and investigative reporting? All of these are skills that can be replicated and are honestly, like, trivially easy with the internet. Allegedly, their journalism school is supposed to teach you some intellectual rigor and, fair and balanced, whatever you want to call it, but the institutions that exist make it very difficult for them. And basically, nobody trusts journalists anymore. I've said sometimes that like conservatives feel the same way about journalists as liberals do about cops. Just because this is something that maybe used to have some institutional legitimacy, but material conditions have changed to the point where, like, it doesn't matter if you say you're a journalist and either it be new old guard people like the Young Turks or Joe Rogan, or just some random dude, not unlike ourselves, just speaking into a microphone.
Mhm.
We can do similar things and get a similar audience. So just
Yeah.
across the board, like, there's this loss of legitimacy that came with all these institutions, and I feel like that's maybe why you're starting to see, they call this the podcast election, because I think it's probably safe to say at this point that new media has eclipsed traditional media, at least in reach.
Mhm. I think that there's a point at which, and there might be a little less of this due to some changes um, in journalism. Like, as much as I'm not a big fan of it, the free press is probably a big publication to mention here. There was a time when, like around the first election for the Trump one, there was a time where journalists had basically just started cribbing Twitter for everything. And so if you were on Twitter, you already knew what the paper was going to say. And they still do a lot of things like this in the sense that, like, I remember recently I saw reports on some kind of very major European newspaper that said Assad had died in his attempt to flee Syria. And then, of course, they had to come back and correct that because it was some bull crap that they found on Twitter or something. And but they write it with all the institutional cachet of being, this country's equivalent of the New York Times or something. And when people see that repeatedly, they're just like, why don't I just listen to Joe Rogan? Why shouldn't I just listen to this other guy who's also cribbing off the internet or just talking out of his ass? And the answer is, yeah, there is no reason you shouldn't. This new media stuff is like, it's a democratization. It is the printing press kind of phenomenon. And it allows us to have people who are doing essentially muckraking type journalism from back in the day. Um, and then plenty of yellow journalism also from back in the day.
Yeah, it feels like we're living in like a neo-gilded age. right now. At least, it's, as basically, history doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. It definitely feels like that is, the era in American history
Mhm.
that, I'm seeing the strongest parallel. Even like, we're seeing, again, to quote Malcolm Cuna, like it's just this, what I guess you could call it, what he calls like a non-denominational populism.
Mhm.
And even, because arguably, at least to me, Donald Trump won because we're in a populist moment, and the Democrats represent the establishment,
Mhm.
for better or for worse. But even like, the Trump movement and some of his bigger people like Elon Musk, like even they can't contain it. Because I think like, the thing with Luigi Mangione killing the United Healthcare CEO, like
Mhm.
there's some people like, your Ben Shapiro's or whatever, but like overwhelmingly, I think the vibe is like, pretty pro Luigi.
Yeah.
At least, it kind of makes me think of something I posted about. You saw something similar to this in the turn of the century with like the rise of anarchism, and like the bombing of Wall Street, and things got
Yeah.
really fucking wild. And it feels like, at least when I'm seeing, in the United States, in Europe, even Asia to a degree, you're seeing just like this huge populist moment that the institutions, are trying their damnedest to keep at bay. But I don't know. What do you think? Because part of me wonders, like, to loop back to the concept of neo feudalism. Part of me wonders, like, maybe we've gotten to the point technologically where, and, with the material conditions of, this massive increase in immigration, we like I said, we just took the L. The ruling class and the elites have solidified their power to the degree with technology and some of these other material conditions. It's going to be, basically impossible to rise up and make significant change. But at the same time, sometimes it feels like, this is just a dam that, there's more and more water rising, or, to use another metaphor, like, you keep on meaning to take the garbage out and you keep on putting more and more garbage on top. And, eventually you're going to try to take it out and the bag is going to rip. Like,
Mhm.
what do you think? Have we gotten to the point where it revolution, big R or lowercase r, is impossible, or is it just like a matter of time and it's going to be way worse than it's ever been?
Well, there's a lot of questions there. They're interesting questions.
Mhm.
I think I'll start by mentioning that the Gilded Age comparison is really apt. You got me thinking when I first saw you make that comparison.
Mhm.
There are some, if we took like a more classical sort of Marxist understanding of the actors involved, there's some pretty big qualitative differences between who's on what side and in which position, and that would have to do with the mature financialization of capitalism. Like as we talked about, like the teal guys are money guys. They're not industrialists like Henry Ford or J.P. Morgan. Um, so they're still doing the whole sort of like robber baron thing, but they're doing it in a way that they could at any point pull out and move to Dubai, which is my punching bag for this kind of person, this kind of ruthless person. But so in that sense, there's still a Gilded Age thing, but we're finding that unlike in your first Gilded Age, there's a group of what I would call national capitalists, the people who actually have interest in fixed industries like the auto industry or um, resource extraction industries, these kind of things, who are on the side of the workers, but at the same time, they're on the side of the workers against the finance guys who are the primary, robber barons of our age. But at the same time, they really want the automation. They really want it. They need to get rid of the workers that they're currently trying to protect. So they're in a very conflicted situation. And I think part of the aspect of neo-feudalism, um, now I don't really know this concept very well. For example, I haven't read the book that you mentioned by Kotkin, which I believe is like one of the canonical books on this topic, right?
I can't speak to the canon. It's just something that got in my head this year, and I read a number of books and articles about it. But
Okay.
he's one of the him and Yara Varoufakis are the ones that I associate with it. Kind of the
Okay.
left and the right poles of it.
So to me, the kind of big concept there is that uh, we're being forced out of productive labor and into some sort of like service and servile position as a class. Like, so we lose the kind of things that gave us the power to do things like massive general strikes as a method of class war. And then, of course, there's also laws against solidarity strikes in many countries, namely in the US, that complicate the use of organized labor as a tool for political pressuring. And once that continues far enough, um, we have a situation where we're all basically like the servants in the manor, and we're sitting around talking about how the Lord sucks, but what are we going to do about it? What are we going to do? And now we have on top of that all actually, this sounds very doomery. I'm not a very doomery guy, but this is starting to feel very doomery if I follow this
Go for
this
it. Let's
line
do
of
it.
thought.
Mhm.
Yeah, I think that like solutions are like, for example, you asked, is the revolution happening? Or is there like, still a chance for some kind of like big social revolution? I would say that there's uh necessarily going to be a chance. It is kind of a socialism or barbarism perspective that I have, but we live in a world where a lot of people will contest this assessment, but like one of the largest economies in the entire world right now, the second largest country by population, I think, is a socialist country. It's not, and there are many other socialist countries that are doing fine. And this is not something that existed prior to the 20th century as a model for like, well, what does it look like for socialism to exist in the 21st century? We actually have it out there in the laboratory. People are doing it in different ways, and it's working and failing in different ways. Just like alternatives from like the right, like right populists, are working and failing in different ways in different countries.
Yeah, I think one of the things you said that really stuck with me is, sitting in the Lord's house and, saying, ah, man, Lord Ambrose, that piece of shit, he sent, my son off to war, but what are you going to do? And
Mm-hmm.
the conversation around people like Elon Musk, or it's just very interesting. And again, it feels so, and I call it's just such peasant mindset of the way that people, be it Elon Musk, some of the, basically the entirety of the mainstream media and celebrity apparatus, Taylor Swift, what have you, like to the degree in which people are like openly wanting to just sign over their agencies, like, oh, this billionaire, I guess, represents my cultural or material interests, so I'm just going to put my faith in them rather than it feels like, acidly, there's some people who are still believers, but for the most part, it feels like people have just like more or less, not even a name yet, but more or less given up in democracy. And it
Mm-hmm.
really feels, that's how that would have been your mindset if you had been like a medieval peasant in France in like, 1460. Like, oh, I
Mm-hmm.
hope, this Lord will be different than the last one. Because I'm seeing, people on the right were so stoked on Elon Musk, and they've just soured on him instantly. Like, what are you going to do?
Yeah.
There's literally nothing you could do to him, and you've already signed over all this power to him culturally. Like, there's not really
Yeah.
recourse.
I think the symbolic aspect of what you're describing there is also at play with people talking about Luigi Mangione. And I think that this is one of the reasons that, if we talk about the Gilded Age, right before the Gilded Age, the propaganda of the deed among anarchists became a big idea. They really thought the spontaneity would work. You just got to kill the right rich guy, and then everybody in the class war will break out and we will win. Um, and you can see in a figure like Mangione, his politics don't matter. And it doesn't actually matter whether it was a political assassination. People are going to project everything they want it to be on there, and people like me are just going to be like, well, it didn't achieve anything, but I'm sure not going to lose any sleep over this guy. But the the relationship of that to like elite overproduction is also a big deal, because he was not some kind of working class hero. This Mangione guy, who is, by the way, not convicted. So I'm going to mention
Mm-hmm.
that. Like,
Mm-hmm.
who knows if it's
Free
actually
my
the
boy.
guy he got. But the he is of the upper echelon of society, and So we find
Class
even
trader.
that, yeah, well, we would like, right? Or just class conflict, intra-class conflict. I think that's a thing that characterized both the Gilded Age and our age, is that there's the ruling classes have conflicts amongst themselves that are stronger than they used to be in between those two eras. And the post-war boom really helped them like smooth that out. The imperialism in particular, the United States throughout the 20th century, helped them smooth that out in many ways. But it's come back because it is a natural sort of problem that they have, because they have diverging material interests that are more related to what the activities of the industries they're involved in are, versus their material interest in exploiting like the working classes, which they're more unified in.
Yeah. Well, I guess that made me think of two things where, like, when you're talking about somebody like Luigi Mangi, is it Mangione or Mangione? Have I been doing a
I think
microaggression?
Mangione is like a New England pronunciation of that kind of name. It makes him sound more like a mobster to me. I don't know.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there
Mangione.
are theories, but let's not jump into that right now. But I mean, you have somebody like him where he's almost like a Rorschach test, right? Where I think
Mhm.
the manifesto was allegedly leaked. It's still Ken Clipperstein Stein. I'm not quite sure. Once again, doing microaggressions. Sorry if you're listening, Ken. I love you. So he allegedly leaked that the manifesto, but it's kind of generic enough that it makes you wonder if, like, it was, like a CIA plant wrote it, or it's just,
Mm.
point being, is just so vaguely populist of like, man,
Yeah.
my grandpa got sick and my mom's back hurt, so fuck you. Um, Whereas, if you contrast that, and everybody loves him, like, again, like once again, you have, some people who are still dork ass nerd hall monitors who want to, say, oh, you shouldn't do that, which, obviously don't kill. We don't endorse
Yeah,
violence
the
here on the
Xanadu review
Xanadu
does not
review.
endorse murder.
Thank you, appreciate it. That having been said, right there, he's definitely having a populist moment where, be it left or right, or just like, your Joe Rogan, largely apolitical person says, yeah, fuck that guy. Contrast that with somebody like Aaron Bushnell, who set himself on fire earlier this year for the Palestinian cause. Flash in the pan, no pun intended.
Yeah,
And it's
I was
almost
actually
better.
to bring him
Yeah,
up. Yeah.
it's almost better if you don't have, like, the stochastic violence where you could kind of project anything onto it. And the other thing that made me think of when you're talking about the interclass conflict, a lot of the times, looking at either the Russian Revolution, or even, like, there are some people who say, myself amongst them, that like FDR in the 1930s, that era was a soft revolution, and like
Hmm.
FDR or Teddy Roosevelt, some of these people of their era were definitely class traders, and there's a fundamental shift in the way that elite class politics and business interest went. Because I think one of the best ways that I've ever heard to understand the conflict in the United States, from like a class or like a materialist analysis perspective, because, as you mentioned, material interests. Sorry, not the politics and like these different coalitions are going to change over years. Um, but the material interest, at least in the United States, has always been a conflict between the land-based powers, who want to work based on like physical things that exist in the United States, be it industry, what have you, and a conflict with the more internationalist business class that wanted to work with Europe and still had ties to the old world. And, after post World War II, that became, even before that, even like a larger international business. And that is the push and pull that you see, in the Civil War, like the Industrial Revolution, what have you, like the different factions in the United States. And that, the 1930s is when we saw the international side really kind of take the lead. And potentially, that's the theory, right, that we're seeing is the nationalist types who want to,
Mhm.
they're striking back because right now, again, the material conditions have come to the point where it's not profitable anymore to have global empire. So I don't know, maybe we're starting to see that more and more, like be it Luigi Mangione or JD Vance or Peter Thiel, what have you. We're starting to see that conflict ramp up again.
Yeah, I would say it's probably more visible in what's going on in Europe than what's going on in the U.S. The U.S. is sort of like, uh, for various reasons, more cosmopolitan on average than than any European country I can think of, except like um, perhaps Germany. But that would be a whole nother thing. I feel like Germans are afraid of having their own culture sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
And that's one thing they agree on across the political spectrum, or appeared to until recently. Now you have um, the sort of like populist movements along the lines of course, the
AFD is having
AFD.
a moment, right?
Yeah, and of course, my favorite among that mix is the Sarah Wagenknecht alliance. I'm a big Sarah Wagenknecht fan from insofar as it matters to me. I think she's an
And
interesting figure.
sorry, brief
Oh yeah,
description
I
of
guess
that.
brief summary. Sarah Wagenknecht was a politician within the German Left Party called Die Linke, and she pushed back on a lot of their sort of institutional leftism, their sort of like love of woke stuff and racial grievance politics and things like this. And she left to found a new party with several figures of her ilk. And they did pretty well, and notably, they did pretty well in places where AFD was also doing pretty well, if I remember correctly. And I don't know if either of these guys have written extensively on Sarah Wagenknecht, but I would say if you're interested in this kind of person, there's of course Eugippius Plague Chronicle on Substack, who has some interesting stuff from the right populist perspective, it seems. And there's Thomas Fazzi, who is also to be found on Substack and Unheard, who has more of the left leaning, maybe more like me or Varoufakis type of character. About these same things. And it would be worth noting that for all of these people I've mentioned, COVID was a massive like change in their thinking and the direction of politics in Europe. And I think that's not coincidental. Like just the seeing the full crackdown of the liberal DEI state when it's in full crackdown mode was an insane thing to see. You know, I remember specifically one time I saw a news article along the lines of like, is the messaging for the COVID campaign inclusive? It's like, are you the vaccination campaign inclusive? Are you joking? Like, what is this?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it feels very how would I even put it, like Mandarin or something, like the pre-colonial China sense of the word. It's just all these magistrates who have created this system for themselves that they have to find a way to insert themselves into. And I'm
Mhm.
pretty COVID agnostic. I think enough time has passed where we can discuss COVID without, fear. Substack is pretty good on free speech stuff. I'm pretty COVID agnostic. I'm of the opinion, try, there were, what was the John Stewart line? There was a virology lab in Wuhan, and that's where it started. I wonder what could have happened. Probably somebody
Mhm.
fucked up. It was released by accident. There was a leak. And then the administrative state probably made it a lot worse than it would have been otherwise. Because there was the super right wing sides like, oh, that's how they put the 5G in your blood or whatever.
Mhm.
But it's one of the things that I don't want to say red pilled exactly, but it's one of those things that definitely for me I was like, this seems the administrative state response to it seems so far in excess of like the scale of the problem at times. I remember one of the main things that first made me think, I don't know about that was when, to bring up our old friend Joe Rogan again, he was talking about ivermectin. And, there's not a lot of evidence that I've seen that it actually helps with COVID in any significant way. But the whole thing about, it was like the CDC did like a statement like, oh, it's a horse dewormer, y'all. You're not a horse. I was like, aren't you
It's
like the CDC? What's with this cutesy language? And I say what you will. I mean, again, I don't think ivermectin helps with COVID, but it's I remember just because it's the funny number, it's the 420th most prescribed medicine like ever. The guy who came up with it got a Nobel Peace Prize for it. It's very effective for like virology and parasites and stuff. Like why would you lie?
yeah.
Why would you go that extra layer? And there's parts about that just felt very much just such an overreach of this administrative state that it gives a little credence, more than a little credence, I think, to some of the conspiratorial side of like using COVID as justification for expansion of the security state. Like, what's that?
Yeah.
I think it's originally attributed to Winston Churchill, like, never let a good crisis go to waste. So what was it like in Europe? Because I was in the US at the time. I was in a blue state, but it's more of a purple state. So, but I had to travel a whole lot during COVID because I did IT for the medical industry. So, and that's a whole another conversation, but it was a very strange experience for me, and how in the US there was just like asymmetrical application enforcement. But it sounds like in Europe it was like pretty severe.
Well, I actually struggled to remember it because I had a pretty bad time around that time, and my memories are pretty weak from that era. But I do remember being very surprised and unsettled by the immediate scale of international cooperation, even outside of the EU. And I made several trips to the US and saw the contrast in various states during that time frame as well. And it was weird how everything seemed to be running their own little experiment in terms of like repressive regulations. It's like it wasn't clearly based on any sort of clinical guidelines that would be uniformly applied across the world in a logical way. It was like, hey, don't let the crisis go to waste. We wanted to test these mechanisms of enforcement and moving people around, which is why I understand some of the more tinfoil hat takes on it. I've got my own tinfoil hat on this subject that I will continue keeping on for the moment. But the thing that really surprised me was definitely like the scale and lack of coherence in the different responses that nonetheless were cooperating across borders in a very very visible way. I was going to mention regarding the kind of populism in general, like health skepticism that comes with it. I was talking to a Marxist friend back in the U.S. about RFK and the kind of potential that he might actually have, as well as what he might want to do. And I think that something that having somebody like RFK in the position that he's going to be in will do is I would love to see all the science I'm supposed to trust and know, but the CDC saying it's horse dewormer, y'all. That's not it. Tell me the science that you're asking me to trust so that I can understand why it's trustworthy. And I think there's going to be a lot of things where people will object to ideas that RFK has or ideas that RFK makes space for. And I'm using him as a symbol for like the entire changes, all the kind of changes that might happen under his administration of the department. But we're going to have a lot of people who are just like giving mainstream pushback, Jon Stewart level pushback. It's like, well, what, you don't trust the doctors? And it's like, I would like to see a study. I am an educated citizen of a democratic country. Where's the information?
Yeah, I think that ends up becoming one of the main problems with it because not to pull a Joe Rogan, but one of my best friends is a doctor, and initially he's like, there haven't been long-term studies. I'm not taking the vaccine, and then he eventually did take it when, like, to his satisfaction, there were some long-term studies on it, and it's like, okay, because it's again, I'm pretty vaccine agnostic. I don't have super strong feelings about it like some people do. That having been said, Again, using RFK as an example, there, because originally it was painted like he was just complete, vaccines are terrible, they cause autism, et cetera, et cetera.
Mhm.
And when I actually read what he had to say, I don't necessarily agree with it, but it's more reasonable of like, do we need to have the vaccination in children to the extent that we do? And he, talks about how there are subsidies that happen, there are laws that were changed, so companies can't be sued if there are side effects, and just the vast number of vaccines that are given to kids. And it's like, is this necessary? And that,
Mhm.
to me, that feels like a reasonable thing to ask, um, or but to people just have such these knee-jerk reactions to it, and you're supposed to quote unquote trust the science, which is to say trust institutions. But you
Mhm.
see the same problem where like some of the other things he wants to do is get rid of excessive preservatives and dyes in food and stuff.
Mhm.
The United States is basically like, the only country in the developed world that allows for that, right? So you look at these, if you try to look at these things in the same context, it's okay, you're going to get a lot of pushback because there's a lot of money to be made about, dyes, preservatives in foods, et cetera, et cetera. And, if, again, this used to be like a more liberal position too, which is something, another one of those things that kind of, it's hard for me to square the circle sometimes, because at least I think we're the same age. Growing up, like one of the foundational things of being a liberal lefty was like, man, fuck the pharmaceutical companies, they're
Oh
not to
yeah,
be
for sure.
trusted. They invent diseases and then sell the cures. And then right around 2020 is where that flipped.
Mhm.
And it's just, I don't know, it's just a very wild moment too, because it's, go ahead.
No, I remember the vaccine, the anti-vax slander. Like one of the reasons I was like willing to hear RFK out, and I'm still willing to hear like people like him out, is because I remember I voted for Stein in 2016. I'm the guy who caused Hillary Clinton to lose, and
Asshole.
yeah, I know she would have. It was her turn. She was so presidential. I'm sorry
So
about that.
qualified. She did the most homework.
but yeah, they did that to her too. They were just like, oh, she's some crazy anti-vax person. It's like, no, actually, she's a medical doctor who's critical of like the mainstream guidelines and pharmaceutical companies. Like,
It
and
used to be a lefty thing.
yeah, again, like it's and so that sort of vibe shift, that realignment, is really disconcerting if you think of it as being something that's of an authentic left rather than like the PMC institutional left. That's the point, because it just, they don't matter. Like they represent an increasingly smaller number of people, and they don't, like, I think the Democratic Party will die, and something will take its place. I don't know if it's going to be something good, um, but I don't think it's going to be something that's heavily based in the professional managerial class. It might actually just be the Democratic Party with a different
I
faction.
guess we'll see. They tried with Kamala to do, okay, what if we were like 2004 neocon Republicans, but we were woke? What if like we had Beyonce and Kamala put her pronouns in her bio, but also Forever Wars? So I'm
Mhm.
glad that, I'm hoping that that died. I feel like, say what you will about Trump, but I have to say like the most like gangster moment to me was that it's often cited where Obama said in that correspondence dinner like say what you will about me, Donald Trump, but I'm something you never will be. I'm the president. And then he becomes president, kind of falls on his face for the majority of the first term, but with his reelection, I think the Obama coalition has pretty much been completely
Mhm.
destroyed. It was that coalition of, basically everybody versus, rural, red states. And we're
Mhm.
already starting to see that fall apart with, if you look at the demographics that came out, pretty significant shifts in Hispanic voters. I posted about like, a couple years back, Jen Pan from Jacobin wrote about like, you're starting to see a shift right amongst Asian American voters because, her logic was Asian American is not even really a good a good demographic to look at because it's made up. You're putting like Chinese people, Japanese people, Thai, all these
Yeah,
disparate
for real.
ethnicities and languages and histories, like who have completely different material conditions. Like somebody who comes here from Thailand is going to be completely different in their worldview for somebody comes here from Japan, for example.
I believe the official Democratic position on this is that they all look the same.
Yeah, because we don't see race, but we do see race because once again, there's all these positions that just become kind of nonsensical. Because I think it's something we've talked about before, and I've posted like I don't think there's been a right in the United States or really like the Western world since 1945. I don't really think there's been a left since 1991. And when you say, I know what you mean when you say it, when you talk about the left wing PMC, it's not really left wing.
Yeah,
It's,
agreed.
liberal capitalist. And again, some of these cultural affectations are shifting again because again, this is a smaller, sillier example. But I remember when you and I were kids or young, if you were somebody who's like, yeah, I just eat organic, I don't trust the government putting all these chemicals in my food. You were a lefty. And now, like, it's like, what are you don't trust the science chud as you eat your, Mr. Beast slop, right? So it feels like we're in just such this moment of flux where, culturally, politically, everything is up in the air. And it's impossible to know how things are going to land.
Sometimes I wonder regarding the shifts, the apparent shifts in voting, especially among Latinos, is I wonder if the Democrats drank their own Kool-Aid too much, or if they believed that the Republicans were right about the idea that they were importing of an electorate. Because I don't know if you know Mexicans.
I do.
Or I don't know if you know other people from Central and South America. They're not woke, like in general. Like they're hardworking, like normal people who don't want their kids to be like trans at school. Like, why would they?
Yeah. No, that's another one of those things that like that again. That's it's somewhat a difficult conversation to have, right? But I want to phrase this carefully. So the United States and the Western world generally really doubled down on immigration and diversity under the assumption that you would see, full assimilation after one or two generations. And I think we're seeing that demonstrably, and not all the time, but like, and there's even like fairly decent rates of it in the United States, depending on the demographic. Hispanic people in particular, like, will disproportionately like even start to identify as white demographically. That having been said, especially when you're doing immigration and the numbers that we're seeing right now, I think not to sound too soy shit lib, but studies will show that the more immigrants you take on from a particular country, your country becomes more like that. They don't become more American, English, French, German, etc. So unfortunately, we are living in a moment, I think, where the 20th century was really kind of an anomaly politically, and in the sense that it was ideological conflict, and now we're reverting back to kind of a great powers conflicts, if that would been kind of a norm for how countries interact with each other for most of history. And countries like you mentioned China, I'm presumably is that other large socialist country, and Russia's not communist or socialist anymore, but they have there's definitely that tradition, and that's only 30 years removed, and that doesn't go anywhere. So all that to say, when you see countries like Russia or China who are specifically, they see themselves as the Chinese civilization for Chinese people. That's something I've, and maybe you'll agree with this, maybe not. I've argued with some lefty friends that like China is like nationalistic and ethnocentric. Russia somewhat less so, because they're more multiracial than people give them credit for. But Russia is very nationalistic as well.
Yeah.
Whereas the United States and the West, particularly in the last decade, the amount of immigration that we've seen, like kind of like you said, a lot of these people, and I know this is a much bigger problem in Europe with a lot of Muslim immigration, they do not share these liberal values,
Mhm.
the, be it, trans stuff or gay stuff, women's rights, they increasingly aren't assimilating into this, and it's causing problems. Like I even remembered reading that like views of Hitler have increased to more positive amongst Gen Z. And one word I was reading was attributing this to the fact that, like, you're getting people from South America, in the United States case, or Africa in the Middle East, or Asia in Europe, and Asia in either case, and they don't have that same cultural milieu that they grew up with. Like if you're from Indonesia, like you're not like you don't
Yeah.
know the difference between a German Jew and a Christian Nazi Jew. That's not like
Mhm.
they don't have a conception of that any more than we would have context for their ethno-sectarian conflicts. So,
Yeah.
super long-winded way to say, like, yeah, it feels like coalitions are breaking down, and the ones that maybe played the long game, either by circumstance or on purpose, it feels like they have an advantage right now, unfortunately. Like if you were Chinese, like, okay, we're going through a hard time, but that's what we do as Chinese people. Whereas in the West, we're all kind of like, either atomized PMC soy boys, girls, or non-binary folk, or like, you're a deracinated blue collar worker. So it's
Yeah.
kind of a difficult moment.
I actually, so, being sort of Republican socialist, of what I'd call a continental variety, because Republican socialism as a term is heavily associated with Ireland, and there it's a little bit more ethnic, um, of a concept than that needs to be elsewhere. The Which isn't in a pejorative sense at all, just as a description. I'm a pretty hardcore civic nationalist. I'm okay with people from like wherever coming to the obviously as an immigrant myself, I came to a country where I believe in the values of the country. I love the country, and I don't want other people coming here who don't have those values. And I want to raise my kids who have those values, and everything like that. And if you have a breakdown in that, but you continue to have immigration uh, from the same places, you end up getting a situation where you have like ethnic clients within a country. So you can have things like, I know in the UK now there's a this isn't necessarily strictly ethnic, but there is like a an Islamist party, like, or some sort of party that is representing Muslims as a political entity. And then you have, of course, the classic example of South Florida politics being entirely captured by Cuban identity politics. The U.S. is just not allowed basically to have relations with Cuba that would improve things for people in other parts of the U.S. Who are not Cuban Americans, because the Cuban Americans don't want it, and they have
Mm-hmm.
a couple of senators that they basically have a lock on. Um, and that's something I hate. I really hate is like ethnic client stuff, and it's it is a failure of integration that goes into this sort of like the country becomes a shopping mall. The country becomes like the store, the aisle at Walmart where you need breakfast cereal, and there's 500 different kinds of breakfast cereal. We're all breakfast cereal Americans.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So, my question for you, Casey, is in the United States and Western Europe, the traditional West, where we've seen this experiment with multiculturalism that seems like, it's had its upsides, but also we're seeing some clear downsides, and some of the phenomena that we've talked about ethnic cohorts that start to, and patronage networks that start to form, as well as there's just kind of a lack of social cohesion that comes at a certain point. Do you see any kind of way forward as trying to reform civic nationalism, multi-ethnic civic nationalism in these countries? Because you said you yourself are an immigrant, and you came there specifically because you had the values of this country, even though your nationality and your ethnicity are different. What is the way forward? Are we just, is the future going to be localism, and we're basically going to be, peasants, trying to find whichever, billionaire lord is going to serve us best?
It's a really hard thing to predict. I can obviously talk about what I hope happens. What I hope happens is a revitalization of civic nationalism that allows for sort of like left-wing nationalism to emerge in various countries. But the main thing is that it's going to emerge country by country, and it's going to be very particular. We were talking about China earlier. There's a good reason that they refer to their system as socialism with Chinese characteristics, and that's because you don't want to have it in America as such. You don't want to. You want if you were going to have a socialism that developed in America, we're going to have in any kind of nationalism that develops in any country. It needs to be particular to that country, and socialism, I would argue, properly considered, is a form of nationalism because the working classes are the nation. They're the lifeblood of the nation. And that, of course, leads to a civic nationalist perspective because you don't have to have a certain ethnic background to become that working person within that nation. However, I think that what we aren't going to see is any sort of success in that vein that completely disrespects the traditional ethnic composition of that nation. So you're not going to have positive developments in America that are based on shitting on waspy guys, and you're not going to have positive developments in Germany that are based on the infinite shame of having been German in that 20-year period, which they also did a bunch of other bad stuff too, but they never talk about the other bad stuff. And I think we're going to see that the resistance to being shat on by new arrivals is stronger than the just infinite goodwill of the West. And I would prefer that to not go in a negative direction, or what I would perceive as a negative direction.
Yeah, I would agree. It makes me think of a book I read this year called Return of the Strong Gods, where they kind of basically, yeah, it's an interesting book. I know he's a much more right-leaning guy, but he makes some good points where basically, like, the cosmopolitanism and internationalism, and he even talks about, the how do I want to put this? Kind of like you said, the shitting on of the traditional waspy heritage Americans who really were like the ones who assimilated the most, and that's basically the only demographic you see that doesn't show in-group preference because it's been kind of socialized out of us. He said realistically, like, that was the result of a really specific time in history and material conditions, and we've arguably already seen the end of it with the rise of Donald Trump, Viktor Orban, some of these other right-wing populists. Seem like they're some in, like, in Europe. You have Le Pen in France. What's her face? I forget who you just said in Germany. Some of these people, like, you're already starting to see the end of the rope on that. Because to me, that is my main fear is, like, things are going to get really ugly if you start to see however you want to put it, traditional heritage Americans, British, Canadians, not exclusively but mostly white, start to openly advocate for, like, white identity politics. And I think that's when things are going to get really ugly, and we're going to have to see there has to be some kind of, like, assimilation is a two-way street, I would say, right? To a certain degree, but at the same time, like, it's just not, like, from a practical point of view, you can't just expect, England or Germany, pick one, to, like, all right, you are the universal solvent forever, and that is just not going to work out. So I'd like to see, if I had any, that'll be my hope for the future, is, like, you're already starting to see, for better or for worse, right? And I'll have people in the audience of this podcast who are more right-leaning and more left-leaning, and some people who are more apolitical. But I would like to see, like, multi-ethnic coalitions where there's a more universal American identity that's universal but still particular, if that makes sense.
No, right? It makes total sense.
Yeah, you can still have an American identity, a British identity, German identity, maintain what created it in the first place without, going full mid-century German.
So that's what I'd
Mhm.
like to see. And then, you're already starting to see that. And because I think, like you said, like be it socialism, even I was reading about like, uh, it's not, it's an unfortunate example. We have to highlight that precedent too. Like fascism in Germany was different than fascism in Italy was different than
Mhm.
fascism in England. Chinese socialism was different than the Russian iteration, different than um, the Cuban iteration, what have you. And what really won in World War II was the American empire and liberalism, and like the sense of like free market liberalism, cultural relativism. And I feel like that's kind of, we're on our last leg there.
Mhm.
And it feels like, there's localism and finding some sort of like, new local identity as globalism collapses is going to be, what's probably going to define the rest of our lifetime and our
Mhm.
children's lifetime. And I'm just hoping to make it like is the least messy that it could possibly be.
Mhm. I personally see a lot of white pills in terms of the direction of immigration politics in Europe, because I know a lot of immigrants, of course, being one, and a lot of those guys are from Muslim majority, backgrounds, like countries, and they don't like the tolerance of Islamic values in Europe. They're like, no, we don't want that. I'd move back to the old country if I liked that. And so they're the ones who are not occasionally, knocking sense rhetorically into native liberals about this kind of question. And I think that we're going to see that they're also the ones who could possibly reach through to some people who would otherwise never listen. Um,
Yeah, you're
and
seeing
I
that
think actually
phenomenon
Sarah
everywhere.
Connect is a good example of that. If I remember correctly, she's at least half Iranian in her background, but I'm not sure about that exactly. Um,
Isn't
but
she lesbian, or am I thinking of a different
no,
person?
you're thinking I actually got them mixed up earlier because I didn't realize you were referring back to what I said about Wagenknecht. Vidal is the lesbian leader of the AFD.
Many such cases.
Yeah, very
Yeah,
strange.
well, I mean, you see that in
Being
the
Nazis
U.S.
again,
as well.
apparently is. I hear that they're the Nazis again. So they've got the gays back in the Nazi party.
Well, I mean, if you know anything about the history of like the early days of the Nazi Party, that's I mean, they're returning to tradition. But you see that in the U.S. too, because like I feel like somebody like Vivek Ramaswamy, to the degree I'll spare. I'm just gonna take people at their word for the most part instead of trying to do are they grifting thing. But like somebody saying what Vivek Ramaswamy is saying, you couldn't have a waspy guy do that right now.
Hmm.
Donald Trump is maybe the only exception, but Donald Trump is the exception to literally everything,
Yeah.
even his own the rules that he establishes. You
Mhm.
couldn't see somebody like JD Vance could not be as openly like nationalistic as Vivek Ramaswamy is, and
Mhm.
you're seeing that more and more. And I noticed that as well. Like when you see people on the right who are any who aren't basically white males, there's always the leftist accusation of them being a grifter, which on one level to me seems like a very like paternalist form of racism of like, oh yeah, I can tell that you're actually like me because you have the right identity markers. You're
Mhm.
just getting one over on the dumb white people, but I'm smart, I can see,
Mhm.
which always bothered me a little bit. But you do see the like, I'm not really a fan of her, but somebody like Candace Owens who's able to get away with saying things that you couldn't say if you were a white guy.
Mhm.
So I don't know that
I
maybe
actually,
they're grifting, maybe that's what they actually believe, but there's definitely a vibe shift that somebody can even say these things
one
again,
of
for better or worse. I don't necessarily agree with all of it.
yeah, one of the more interesting things that has developed in the last few years is what I'm calling like the rise of the based Hindu. Um, because we have people like Ramaswamy, who, if I remember correctly, is he calls himself like a monotheistic Hindu because Hinduism is a very complex thing. It's not really a religion; it's like an entire like system of religions.
Mm.
And there's him, there's Tulsi Gabbard, who I believe is still in some capacity a Hindu, and then you have
Mhm.
Usha Vance, standing right
Mhm.
next to her Catholic convert husband,
Mhm.
and she's about to
Nikki
be
Haley.
the second lady. you know.
Hmm.
And we're getting this before we see a Muslim president.
Well, how could you forget Kamala Harris, who is either black or Indian, depending
Oh yeah,
on,
exactly.
yeah. And
How could
then
I forget? They actually convinced me she was black. That's how I forgot.
yeah. No, I mean that's it does seem like, again, it's one of those things that you find interesting, like especially like because I'm kind of a history buff. I think you are too. Like if you're looking at it from the 1,000 foot view, you're starting to see, like, Indian immigrants in the United States and the West at large seem to be like a major counter elite that's starting to form, because that's what I was reading, people like Vivek Ramaswamy talk about, like, yeah, this is why we came to America, because we share these values. And interesting enough, I was talking to one of my lib friends, like, oh yeah, I know, I work with this guy and he's an immigrant and he voted for Trump. And it's like, she didn't get it. It's like, well, as you probably well know, very well, legal immigrants tend to be some of the people who are the hardest on illegal immigrants.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, of course. It's a complete, and people in the U.S. who don't get this, they just don't know the history of like um, immigration in the U.S. Like famously, Cesar Chavez with the United Farm Workers was really harsh on illegals. Like you really hear my accent come out when I say illegals.
Legals.
But the this is like not a new phenomenon at all, and especially when it's not even people who like. There's this assumption that guy looks like me, I like him. Like how ridiculous is that?
Mm-hmm. It's very
And
like a neo white man's burden type of racism that you see. I think I've shared a couple of those screenshots with you that I've sent of like, it's something I'm starting to collect on Substack, of like unhinged libs saying the most fucking racist shit you would ever heard in your life. Going
yeah,
like, oh, I can't wait till Trump, all these traitors, they're gonna round them all up and send them back, and they're gonna deserve it. It's like, oh, Indians just like Trump because of, they worship Modi, and they're both authoritarians. It's like,
mhm,
Jesus fucking Christ, you could go to a Klan rally and their face
yeah,
would turn red for some of the shit you're saying.
yeah,
But, how are you doing for time? There's one more thing I wanted to get into, and then we can.
yeah. Let's hit one more thing. I will need to leave soon and take care of my animals. But
Okay, fair enough. Quick. Since I feel this kind of ties everything together. The whole discussion about tech, traditionalism, and everything. Let's talk about our boy Ted Kaczynski.
yeah, we didn't hit Ted yet.
Yeah, I thought it would be worth bringing it because I wanted to bring it up in the Luigi Mangione thing,
Yeah,
because people are calling him like the new Ted Kaczynski, because he's like he was a tech guy who is anti-tech. Um, you know, Ted Kaczynski obviously had a much more well thought out manifesto, but it's interesting that we're seeing like all these more and more like these individualized instances of violence that are
mhm,
kind of following that Ted Kaczynski blueprint in a way.
yeah. I mean, I was thinking every time I think about Ted, the first thing I think about is something that really like felt like a moment of clarity when I read it, which is a story of him. When he was I think he was while he was actively being MK Ultra'd, at the university where they were just abusing him psychologically all the time. I think he got it in his head that he wanted to transition, and he went to a
Mhm.
gender clinic. And then he was sitting there, and he was just like, "This is the craziest idea anyone has ever had, that I can become the other sex." And I think about that a lot, especially because there's such a connection between primitivism and like radical feminism in the form of like Deep Green Resistance, if you're familiar with them. Um, and the in particular, I'm thinking here of like Derek Jensen and Lear Keith. Lear Keith is also like the co-founder, I believe, of Women's Liberation Front, and maybe he's still their chairperson. But it is an interesting thing that that you get so back to nature that you recognize like the embodied aspect of just being a person. And I think that this is something that you see in Ted's work and in his disdain for like society, is that he feels that he's constantly pretending that he's not just an animal. And I feel like somebody like Mangione being interested in that it makes sense to me, because if you're going through like physical pain all the time, you're constantly reminded of how physical your existence actually is. What do you think of that? Is that
No, I would absolutely agree. I mean, just as a side note, I found out like if you read like the court testimonials that he did, because he wanted to defend himself, and all his letters, like apparently he over the years like hyper fixated on the doctor in the gender clinic. So it's just I mean, that's maybe too big of a topic to get into right now, but like with the transhumanism angle, I feel like, especially if you work in tech, um, it's you go to one of two ways. You can either go like the Ray Kurzweil, where it's almost Gnostic in a way, where like you hate your own physical existence, and there's dysphoria in every sense of the word with the world, living in your body versus so much of your existence is in the digital world, and it's all infinitely changeable and hackable. And you get very disconnected, and you get like these weirdos like Peter Thiel, who like, you could see him uploading his mind into some like, I have no mouth and I must scream style, like supercomputer. Or you go like the Ted Kaczynski, Luigi Mangione direction. I don't know. It's just it feels like it's very apropos and kind of puts a bow on all of this, because it feels like that is one of the defining struggles of our day. Like, are we physical beings who exist in the real world with real needs that are connected to our physical reality and the people around us, or is it all completely superfluous? We can make these changes on our own. We can be whatever we want, and we're not limited by physical reality.
Yeah, which of course is terrifying to me, because I don't believe it's actually possible. So the first day that they unveil some sort of way to upload your brain into something, your consciousness into something, I don't know if you've ever heard of a video game called Soma, and here's a spoiler for the video game called Soma, but at the end, the guy does something like that, and he just continues living while this copy of him is in there, and that's the best case scenario for this kind of thing, rather than, grandma's in the great cloud in the sky over there. She's definitely talking to you. That's definitely not an LLM. She's definitely not actually dead. And then when does it stop?
Yeah, it gets very scary very quick, especially if you like, the systems that exist right now. Like, it's like, oh, you want to talk to your dead grandma's memory? Well, you're going to need to do some more microtransactions. That to unlock the memory of grandma, where she baked you those cookies, you got to get your monthly loot box, or that's just nothing of like loot box of happy childhood.
Don't give them ideas, PJ.
All right, sorry.
We can discuss this perhaps in the cabin in the woods.
Yeah, leave all your phones, at the gate of the woods, and if you have any fillings, take them out. Tinfoil hats, mandatory. That's my my tinfoil hat theory, is that tinfoil hats actually work, and that's why they psyoped us into thinking that they don't work.
Well, no, see, I'm actually convinced that they act as antennas, so they get better access into your mind if you have them on. That's why I don't wear mine.
All right. Well, we'll have to. Well, maybe do a part 2, and we'll have the tin hat discussion.
Yeah, and then people can hear that, and they can trust the science.
Yeah, we'll have empirical evidence. We can both have our followers. We'll try different things. We'll get a control group. It's that's science, I believe. But anywho, I guess do you have any plugs? Anything? Any like upcoming articles? This is going to be published probably late January, so keep that in mind for when you're going to have stuff out.
Yeah, well, hopefully by then, but perhaps right after. I will have a rather long piece out that's going to be about Islamic integration problems in Europe, and just like the general like quote migration crisis. And it's sort of structured around, as a review of a book called Prey by Ayaan Hirsi Ali. So if that's not already out by the time this one comes out, I encourage you guys to be on the lookout for that. Other than that, my regularity of publication is not sufficient to give much of a peek into the future. But I am very much looking forward to hearing from anybody who has discovered my work through Disappearance and would like to comment on it.
Yeah, well, go ahead and subscribe to Casey if you're not. Again, secondary contradictions. So I always have my final sign-off question, but I always like to end with, since we've got a little bit doom and gloom, not too much. So what in the world right now is making you optimistic or hopeful for the future? Or if you don't have anything, like, what's something that would?
I also think it's so amusing that you had, if there's none, what would?
Yeah,
But,
I've gotten that answer a couple times, so I always add that as a caveat.
Yeah.
That's for the Black Pill Bros and Doomer enjoyers.
As I said, I do think that like the rise of like sort of populist sentiments in Europe is a very positive thing, and I of course have my preferences for where like which direction it goes economically, but the shared aspects of that I think it's nice to see people not afraid to talk like that. I hear people talk very normally about these kind of things, and especially I hear like people from the backgrounds in question, instead of being like, well, we're getting oppressed by this wave, they're like, yeah, I don't like that either, and I don't want people getting it mixed up. I don't want people thinking that because I look like this I'm going to act like that. So that's kind of a big white bill for me, and it's probably the main response I would have to that question right now. As you said, I think that there's a lot of stuff up in the air, a lot of stuff in flux. So there's going to be some interest. I think 2025 is going to be a fantastically interesting year, but I worry that it might be too interesting.
And what is that? That possibly apocryphal quote of like, it's a Chinese curse of you may live in interesting times.
Yeah.
Well, Casey,
we certainly, somebody close to us.
Yeah. I was going to say, Casey, my friend, I appreciate you. May you live in interesting times. Thank you for coming on.
Thank you very much for having me.
Yeah. Talk to you later, buddy.
All right.